My name is Shannon Douglas. This is the story of how the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in August of 1995 fired off 77,000 rounds of ammunition in a single afternoon in the largest deployment of RCMP forces to that date in Canadian history. I wrote this in 1999. Taking Your Stand. Perspectives on Gustafson Lake. It's a sunny August morning about 7 o'clock. You can tell already by the color of the sunrise and the sky devoid of clouds that it's going to be a hot day. You're up cooking breakfast in a cast iron frying pan over a grill of the hibachi. The birds are chirping, and an eagle is flying in circles overhead, riding morning thermals and casting its broad gaze earthwards looking for a meal. Not too far away is a shallow man-made lake that's been stocked with fish, and even at a distance you can see ripples left by the jumpers, feeding on the rare August mosquitoes. You are there with your children and your wife, and you're happily breathing in the fresh morning air. You're a spiritual leader and elder of your community, and this summer you're the keeper of a sacred burial site. You're on land that was inhabited by your grandfathers, but which is now claimed by a cattle rancher. 5 years ago, you informed the rancher that this site was sacred and that you had a vision of an annual traditional ceremony there, and he gave you permission to use the land for 10 days a year as long as you didn't build any permanent structures. He gives you these conditions, but he knows you have legitimate claim to the land as ancestral. The rancher also knows that you believe that the burial site is outside the land he claims as his. The parcel of land which he claims has not been surveyed in over a century, and the site of the lake is on the edge of that parcel. Over the last few seasons, you've been seeking to have the land resurveyed. One of the boundaries the rancher claims is the lake on which you're camped, but it didn't exist at the time of the survey. You believe that the boundary to his land is at least 3 miles away, at another lake, because the lake near your campsite was constructed only 60 years ago and couldn't appear on a 100-year-old deed. You've been seeking to establish the validity of your claim, peacefully, patiently, through due process over the last few years, so you can do justice to and honor your ancestors. But the rancher hasn't been compliant. He doesn't want the land resurveyed because if it is, his power to control that territory will be taken away. The ceremonial site is at a mass grave that holds hundreds of victims of an epidemic which ravaged your ancestors over a century ago. It killed more than 2/3 of them in just a few short weeks. Their remains are buried there next to the man-made lake under the white man's cow pasture. As of late, it's been defaced by the rancher's free-roaming cattle. Against his instructions, you've built a fence around 1/6 of an acre to keep them from trampling and defecating on the grave. This barrier also serves in the sacred ceremony that for the last 5 years you've participated in. You've also built a small shack to shelter you and your family as caretakers of the site. The rancher isn't happy with the buildings, and a few weeks before the Sundance this year, he came into camp with more than a dozen ranch hands, one of them brandishing a bullwhip. And he interrupted the ceremonial purifications to serve you with an eviction notice. He claims there have been complaints from campers and hunters against members of your camp for violent and intimidating behavior. He claims that this is why he's serving you with eviction, not because he wants to interrupt your traditions or hinder your claim. There's confusion surrounding the legality of the rancher's claim, and because he hasn't been cooperative in having the land surveyed, you've maintained your position of occupation for the purposes of ceremony and site protection. In consultation with your lawyer, when he served you with the eviction notice, he refused to accept it for 2 reasons. It was stale-dated and legally invalid, and because you maintain your position that the status of the land is in dispute. After that day, a group of people calling themselves defenders appointed themselves mediators for this dispute without your consent. They met with the rancher, and when they returned to camp, they told you that they'd been threatened with physical force if they didn't leave the site. A few days later, a drunken employee of the rancher came into camp and was yelling that the police were going to invade. and that the site is going to be burned. The defenders enlisted the help of a high-profile lawyer who's an expert in your type of claim. He has informed you that you're within your rights to maintain your position, that since the land you're on is unceded territory, even if the rancher claims title, the title isn't valid under international law. Up until then, you'd been working within the system of law under which you live, the system of law which is that of the newcomer government, the Ministry of Indian Affairs, and the elected band council leadership. You've been working to establish that the land you're on is crown land, not private land at all. But suddenly it's become something much bigger. The defenders, with the help of their lawyers, have issued demands which, although they're within the rights given to you in the Constitution and within the parameters of international law, they're inflammatory and far beyond the kind of dispute that you bargained for. You know that the lawyers is correct when he says that the police would be complicit in cultural genocide and in failing to abide by the rule of the law by invading the camp. But the rumors persisted, and the defenders' passions were flaring. The defenders were issuing statements regarding their stance of armed resistance against the police and their invasion based upon their rights. The police know your position because RCMP members have attended meetings between yourself, band council leaders, and the rancher over the last several years as observers. That was when this was still a civil dispute. They know that even though this has grown far beyond the kind of process you expected, that you have the rights to ask for an international third-party mediator, that you have the right to ask for accountability from the Department of Indian Affairs and the provincial and federal government for the sale of unceded Indian territory to newcomers. This morning, a month later, you're alone with your family. Your community of fellow traditionalists and the defenders have performed the sacred dance and purifications for the year, and most of them have left the area. You're hoping that the worst is over. You're enjoying the peace and serenity of the moment, but all of a sudden, the birds stop chirping. You look up and the eagle is gone. Your dog starts barking and you see a man in camouflage with black face and a helmet and a high-powered assault rifle running across the road. A few moments later, you notice another man in a similar outfit with a pair of binoculars in a tree a few hundred yards from the camp. He's watching you. It puts you on alert. You confront one of the men and you see that he's not wearing any markings. You can see he's part of an organized force, however, well armed and camouflaged. He doesn't stop to talk. You're afraid because there are many people who don't like what's happening with your claim, including some of your own people. You have a radio phone in your truck and you call the police because you believe that you're about to be attacked by these unknown forces. You're afraid that they might be terrorists or that they're some militia faction. Maybe they're white supremacist. You're afraid to leave your wife and your children. You call the police and one of the officers from town tells you that he'll come out to camp. But he doesn't show up. A few hours later, a helicopter flies over and no one comes to your aid. You don't know what's happening, and the police haven't responded to your call. They refuse to answer your questions. You call your friends who've just recently left after the 10-day ritual. You tell them about the men in the bush with the guns, and they share your fear. Some of them gather supporters and come to stand with you, and you continue to petition the police for support, but it never arrives. The defenders seem to have garnered the support of most of the people who've returned. They're talking about the New World Order, the NWO, a name for an unconscious code of ethics they believe is inherent in the legal system, in police forces, in government bureaucracy, and corporate policy, which protects the economic and political status quo of the newcomers. The defenders are afraid because the New World Order is a faceless and immoral entity composed of groups which support each other to protect the established political and material investment of the majority dominator culture. They're afraid because they believe that they're facing the long arm of the NWO. Before you know it, you're hearing things about a band of heavily armed terrorists that are holding land in your area. You hear that the police forces are working to find a peaceful solution to the problem. For the moment, you and your fellows are afraid of the terrorists until someone realizes that the terrorists they're talking about are you and your encampment. It's then that you realize that the unknown soldier who you saw sneaking around your camp wasn't a terrorist at all, at least not the kind you thought. They were the police, and they've now surrounded you, armed with heavy artillery, huge assault vehicles, and helicopters. You and your friends, armed with only a few bush weapons for protection against animals, are besieged by hostile forces who cut you off from communications, food sources, and water. You hear on the portable radio that you're being considered radicals and revolutionaries, and that the police are concerned about violence. You hear them hinting that it might not be possible to negotiate a peaceful solution to this confrontation, and you're faced with the possibility that you will all die in this camp. Your name is Percy Rosette. You're a shoe swap faith keeper. You're 62 years old. You've always been an Indian. It's one of the only things you have left. It's not even the right name. You've always been at the bottom of the social pole in Canada. In all those 62 years, you've not known a time when you weren't discriminated against. You grew up with derisions like wild savage, evil heathen, red nigger. Grew up with stereotypes like drunken Indian and lazy Indian. You grew up seeing things that would astound and horrify people who are proud to be Canadian. You try and tell people about your experience. No one listens. You've been patiently and diligently trying to get people to listen for years. Some do, but very few. The ones that listen are the ones who can relate to you. They're the ones coming back to the old ways to begin healing, like you did 15 years ago when you went dry. You've been healing the hurts because of what you grew up with, and you're still angry. You believe with all your heart that your problems are because you came so close to losing your culture, because it came so close to being stolen from you. You grew up seeing the side of the government and the police that white people don't see. White people see what they want to see, and they didn't want to see you and your problems. Instead, they wanted to make you just like them. The government wanted you to be white. You're red. The government sent you to residential schools where you saw things that white people would call hell. You saw hell at the hands of the church and the government, and you endured. You suffered for years afterwards because you weren't sure who you were. Were you red? Were you white? Where did you fit? You were just a drunken Indian. You hid behind alcohol and buried the pain and suffering and conflict inside you because you're told by the whites that you were evil. You're a savage. From what you could see, they were the savages. They put you and your family and your community on reservations before you were born. They took away your means to feed your community, and they tried to take away your connection to the earth, your connection to the Creator. They gave you money to make it better, but it didn't. It made it worse. The only ways for you now are the old ways. It's the only way that makes sense. It was a long time before you could take pride in your ways and the ways of your grandfathers and grandmothers and ancestors. It was a long time before you could begin to find your place, but it helped that you knew something incredibly powerful. You learned about the white history while you were learning about your own. Not the history they taught you in the schools, but the history of laws of settlement, the history of the white man coming to this place, the history of the outright theft of lands from your people. You learned about the laws against genocide and what it means. You learned that you're a victim even by the standards of your oppressors. You learned that before Canada became a country, that the settlers here were loyal to a king who passed laws over 200 years ago that are still valid today. It was called the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and the king was George III. This proclamation was recognized in the laws which made up the newcomer government in 1867. It was included in the Constitution of 1982, but like many of the words given to you by the white man, they're empty. It's just one example of this government's dealings with your people and the communities of First Nations of the land that this government calls Canada. They promise one thing, they do another. It's the smiling face they show you with the black heart that they don't. You know that this proclamation, still valid in international law and enshrined in the Constitution of 1982, is your power, it's your justice. It's the way to make the government accountable for the things that it did. It says, no crown subject, no newcomer shall encroach upon Indian territory unceded without first signing treaties, and in the history of your community, for the land of all your relations, there have been no treaties. There have been no surrender of lands by your people, only a slow and deliberate appropriation by the whites. They took it away without any respect for their own laws, without respect for your community, and without respect for the land. It's almost gone now, the old ways, the heart of the land and the heart of your people. The land of your grandfathers is full of newcomers who built fences and roads and mines and towns. It's full of newcomers who take and don't give. They take the trees from the land, they take the fish from the rivers, they take the ores from the earth, and they take from your people. They stole your memories. What they leave behind is waste. You found this out about these laws, and you tried to make people understand, and that you and your people had rights that had always been denied you, and no one listened. In spite of all this, you're a proud Shuswap man, a traditional man. While you were searching for the red heart to match your red face, you found a great and powerful knowledge. In white terms, you found a stone that would slay the giant. You've seen your whole life how traditional elders and chiefs have tried to be recognized by this government. You've seen how the due process of the newcomer has worked for you and your people by keeping them fighting, keeping them protesting, keeping them tied up in the courts for generations, only to be ignored or double-crossed or offered money. You don't want money. You want peace. Still, with this knowledge and this experience of the dark heart of the white government, you try yourself to be heard through the right channels, the channels which the white man created in your land, the elected band council leaders, the Department of Indian Affairs, the Assembly of First Nations, Parliament. You spent years, played the government game, traveled to the United Nations to speak and to plead for the rights that your government says you have. You traveled to the Netherlands, where you spoke at the International Courts of The Hague. You prayed that the newcomer would honor the promise of a dead king. Your passionate words, your dedication to your community has been repeatedly brushed aside, and you've been turned away again and again, ignored. You see this ignorance as convenient to the white man, because if he admits that he's breaking his own word, then he has to amend the wrongs. And for the white man, the cost of that is too great. An admission of guilt and a recognition of your rights threatens the ways of the newcomer, the ways of harvesting the fruits of the earth in the name of money for business and for jobs for white people. An admission of guilt for the wrongs of the past threatens the government as it is now. It would force the white man to make amends for the ways they've treated you. The white government is afraid. It doesn't understand what you want. The only thing it can manage is that you want to break the bank. But you don't want money, compensation, not like the white government thinks. You want recognition, respect. You want justice and healing. You and your community are forgiving and honorable people. The white government is not. Since they can't say they're sorry, they don't understand forgiveness. Since all they know is lies, they can't accept the truth. Since all they know is their ways, they don't understand yours. They're afraid of them. They're afraid of you. You're an organic farmer growing food to support yourself and your family. This summer, you're at a sacred site for a sacred ceremony, and the landowner wants to evict you. He says there have been problems. You're frustrated and angry. You see the whole world against you. The white government with the dark heart, the United Nations in their glass towers, and the international courts in The Hague ignoring international laws. Now, you're seeing the police again, like you've always seen them, as the enforcers of the injustice served by this government upon your people. You're angry, despite the great patience and wisdom of your culture. You're ready to defend what remains of your traditions, what you've managed to find and learn and remember. You are ready to fight for them, and you're ready to die for them because you've nothing left to lose. Your name is William Jones Ignace. Traditionals call you the Wolverine. You're faced with a crisis. There was a massive firefight today. You're not quite sure what happened. That's to be expected in your situation, but you're in a need-to-know position. You're an RCMP officer called to manage a potential deadly situation and are in charge of a massive deployment of officers. At the moment, you don't realize, but it's the largest deployment of RCMP forces in Canadian history. There are over 400 men and women in your command, plus PSDs, FLIRs, helicopters, communication experts, financial support, psychologists, and extensive weaponry. Despite the forces at your command, you're ill-equipped to deal with the situation. Neither you nor any other RCMP officers has ever managed an operation this size. The interior town you're in doesn't have the facilities to support the number of police officers called to handle the dispute. And because of this, officers are sharing overcrowded hotel rooms and sleeping in shifts. Many of them have been called up from Vancouver. The rest are from wherever they could be spared within the province. And this leaves police forces across Western Canada taxed to the limit. Officers are double and triple shifting to maintain community service, while as far as you can tell, your forces are here in the Cariboo region indefinitely. There's approximately 20 people armed in a camp 30 kilometers from town. Most of them are natives, but there's a contingent of white supporters with them. They've dug trenches and foxholes to defend their positions, and they've erected buildings and a fence on private land. They're squatting illegally, heavily armed, and they're threatening armed resistance to a police invasion. You're treating this as a criminal investigation. There have been several instances over the last few months where campers, ranchers, and forestry workers, as well as police officers, allege that they've been terrorized by natives in the area. You've known for almost a year that something would have to be done with the natives here, and the time is now. A month before the decision was made to assemble such a massive force of police officers, a cache of weapons was seized from 2 native men when they were arrested for illegally fishing in the area. The seizure included a semi-automatic assault rifle and some handguns. Only a few days ago, when a patrol was doing reconnaissance on the camp, they were again fired on by a camp member. The leader of the group and his thugs have been publicly advocating armed resistance to an RCMP invasion. They're calling for political support, and you've already heard of protests and demonstrations in Victoria and Ottawa. He, with the help of his lawyer, claimed to be within his rights in resisting what they feel is an imminent invasion by the police. By definition, they're terrorists, and their situation requires immediate attention, although negotiations, of course, remain your top priority. You have a covert military support in this operation, but the official word is that the military isn't involved. After what happened at Oka, it's not feasible politically or in terms of public opinion to show military force in a dispute involving natives. The armed forces, however, has supplied you with everything you need, which you have at your disposal. Although you can't admit it, there's even tanks behind the hills just in case. You have dozens of RCMP emergency response teams, ERTs, in the area. Officers trained in the use of M16s, sniper rifles, and SWAT team tactics. These teams have been trained to handle hostage takings, drug raids, and crisis situations, but none of your men have ever seen anything like this. You have several 17-ton Bison armored personnel carriers, and in addition to helicopters, you have a medium-altitude reconnaissance tool called a Westcam video surveillance system, which is installed in a single-engine plane that flies in circles over the camp. You've established a safe zone for the members of the armed native camp, an area in which their personal safety is guaranteed, and in spite of several incidents involving gunfire against your helicopters and against 2 officers in an RCMP Suburban, you're still maintaining your objectives of achieving a peaceful resolution. Around the safe zone, your forces have installed motion detectors and tripwires to alert your teams of movement outside the camp perimeter, and ERTs patrol the area 24 hours a day. The road to camp has been blocked by RCMP teams, and they monitor everyone who comes and goes from the camp. Although your agency has the resources to handle any eventuality, the objective is peaceful resolution. The show of force is only part of your operational plan. You also have a team of negotiation specialists and the two-pronged plan of actively negotiating for a peaceful surrender while displaying an obviously overwhelming force is to make it easy for the terrorists to surrender and difficult for them to maintain their encampment. It's the carrot and the stick approach. Handling the media is another major priority, and you brought in a specialist. Resolutions to this type of standoff are never easy. You're well aware of the possibility that this scenario could lead to another Oka, Ruby Ridge, or Waco, and this isn't something that you want. So you're approaching the situation with the utmost caution and patience. You're aware that the issues raised here are a possible political nightmare, and it's important that the whole situation be handled with the utmost care and sensitivity. You have the entire country watching, and the standoff has even drawn international media. The premier was quoted by a newspaper saying the camp members were seized with a cult mentality, and indeed their position is politically radical. One of them inside the camp is talking nonsense about how the police, the government, and the native band councils are part of the New World Order. He maintains that the police will only get him out in a body bag. This is making it difficult to send in negotiators because the terrorists don't trust anyone at all. Even Ovid Mercredi, the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, couldn't get anything accomplished. Their lawyer is speaking on their behalf and advising them in their standoff. You've had to let him into camp, but he came out without accomplishing anything. Not for your position. Instead, he inflamed things by presenting an affidavit which claims that your forces were the ones instigating the crisis. He's advocating their stance and actually stated publicly that the terrorists are within their rights to be using force to defend their position. He's demanding an audience with the Queen and an international third party to mediate the dispute. He's already demanded that charges of hate propaganda, complicity in genocide, criminal trespass, and criminal settlement be laid against you personally, and you aren't sure whether to laugh or to be angry. He sent the letter demanding those charges to the Attorney General. You decide that since his charges are so far outside the ideas of mainstream Canadian culture, that you'll give him enough rope to hang himself in the court of public opinion. He does this by allowing himself to be charged with contempt of court and assault when he threw papers at a judge and demanded that his charges be heard. He's in jail, held on psychiatric remand. This throws public opinion clearly in your favor and eliminates a source of conflict which will allow you to work towards a peaceful solution to the terrorist standoff. You have these assets of experience on your side, not your own, but the experience of failures and lessons from the past. Oka, Ruby Ridge, and Waco were political disasters, but you have the benefit of knowledge of how not to handle the situation. The strategy for this confrontation is similar to the one used in the Gulf War. Colin Powell's personal philosophy of life in war: overwhelming force, cautiously applied. Your objective is to have the strategic means available, but to use them only sparingly and in a tactical manner. And right now, you're waiting for the field reports to come in. You're on an ERT patrol on a 17-ton armored personnel carrier, or at least you were before you ran into issues. You, your partner, and driver are now huddled inside your vehicle waiting for help. The sound of gunfire is non-stop, and you're sitting targets inside the terrorist camp perimeter. There must be thousands of rounds flying outside the armored transport, but you're safe now that you're able to close the hatches. Nevertheless, each time you hear and feel one of the bulletproof tires being shot out of your Bison, you wonder if you'll survive. The APC is lilting badly to one side, although you can hear of a rescue effort being mobilized over the radio headset you're wearing. You wonder if it'll come in time. You wonder if you'll see your wife again. You wonder if you'll see your child. You look over at the two other occupants huddled inside the disabled vehicle, and you see your fears mirrored in their faces. You were waiting to make an arrest just down the road from camp. The explosives team had rigged a plastique data sheet across the gravel road at the edge of the negotiated safe zone. It was rigged to be remotely triggered in order to disable their vehicle if it strayed outside the perimeter that the RCMP had established around the camp. The little red truck, whose driver and occupants had been firing upon police helicopters for the last 2 weeks, crossed the line. Your understanding was that the explosive was designed to disable the vehicle and make possible the safe apprehension of the suspects in it without the exchange of fire. You believed that these people were ready to be martyred for their cause and that they were heavily armed. Steel tire spikes to puncture the tires in the vehicle could have allowed the occupants of the truck time to grab their weapons and make a stand. The data sheet would provide enough shock, hopefully, to minimize the risk of firearms exchange. You heard the command for the detonation. Tensions were high. You and your partner were exposed from the waist up through the hatches of the APC, and you saw the explosion from behind the truck as the driver of the APC was chasing it down. You saw the battery fly through the air above the dust and gravel thrown up by the blast. The dust cloud obscures your view of the vehicle and its occupants for a moment, and after the APC that you're in rams the truck twice to make sure it's disabled, you realize that the vehicle occupants are well away and running through the bush back towards the lake. That's when all hell broke loose. You were in the camp in the middle of the afternoon when 2 camp members had gone in the truck to get water and firewood, and they got into trouble. Big trouble. The camp dog is with him, and you're waiting for the truck to get back, like you've been waiting for the last 2 weeks for some kind of word on whether the Attorney General will allow the international third party to be brought in, waiting for the negotiators who are due in camp any time. You're tired, under pressure. You've been under incredible stress for the last few weeks. The bastards have been using psychological warfare, running you down, keeping you from sleeping, keeping you from eating. You've been hearing the news reports over the radio and from the negotiators who are coming into the camp, and they're full of lies. There are some truths to what they say, but there are utter fabrications also. Hearsay, hate propaganda. You don't even know what to believe. The more horror stories you've heard about the activities of camp members that aren't true, the more you're sure that the RCMP wants you all dead. The more you're sure that they want to justify their lying so that they can use any amount of force on you. That they're just waiting until they can make up a good enough excuse to lay siege to the camp, and then all of you will die. It's like they've always done. They humor you to your face, but behind your back they manipulate you, plot your destruction. Black hearts and blind followers. You have appealed to everyone you could think of for help, even to the decency of officers who are surrounding your camp. You've informed them that their actions are genocidal and that they have a moral obligation to lay down their weapons and refuse to follow orders which violate their sacred oaths. No one is listening. It was mid-afternoon when you heard the explosion from across the lake. You heard 2 of your fellows screaming, and you see them burst from the bushes a few hundred meters across the lake and dive in. They were being pursued by 2 assault vehicles, and there was men half out of the hatches firing at your friends who were unarmed. You could see the bullets hitting the water all around them, and you grabbed your gun and returned fire, as did some of your campmates. You could see the 2 people swimming back to camp, diving under the water to avoid the hail of bullets all around them. They made it all the way to your side of the lake, and then they stood up. They turned to face the police with their hands in the air. You can tell the woman was shot. She stood up and raised her hands, and then she recoiled and fell to the ground. You were laying fire ahead of them to keep them in place until your APC crew could get between the 2 on the shore and their camp and cut them off. Your objective was to arrest them. As you were speeding there, the old man stepped right into the path of the carrier. He was firing on you and your crew with a rifle. You were taking crossfire from snipers in the bush, and a bullet disintegrated as it hit the armored lid of the hatch beside you. Dust and bits of lead sprayed all over you. You continued to fire anyway. There was so much gunfire you had no idea where it was coming from, so you just kept shooting. You could hear orders over the headset. There was pandemonium on the radio. Yelling, barked orders, and you heard clearly the green light. Shoot to kill. Run him over. The driver turned on the old man, and he dodged the APC again and again, ducking through the trees and shooting out the tires. The APC was running over trees to get at him, and he just kept dodging and ducking. You couldn't believe how crazy this man is. He just wouldn't give up. You couldn't believe how crazy he was. By that time, you had no idea where the 2 suspects from the truck were, and then all of a sudden the APC came to a halt. The driver tried to reverse, and you heard the sound of whining and grinding metal. You're stuck now. The gunfire is louder and more consistent than ever. You're out of ammo. No choice now. Get down. Close the hatch. Outside you can hear gunfire, and on the headset you hear the driver calling for help. You're stranded. You're out of breath now and out of rounds, and you run back to the camp after you make sure the APC wasn't going anywhere. You shot out most of the 8 tires, just trying to keep it from running you over. It doesn't look like it's going anywhere. Now you can hear more carriers coming through the brush and the trees, and you hear the heavy artillery starting to go off. Adrenaline is pumping, and you dive for cover behind some logs in the camp. Over the next 2 hours, the RCMP relentlessly pounds the camp. All you hear is the sound of automatic weapons and the ricochet of bullets off what rocks they hit. The ground is being torn up, and within minutes, the bark from all the trees around the camp is stripped from the ground level to 15 or 20 feet in the air by gunfire that the RCMP is laying down. Everyone in your camp is on the ground. Some have taken cover in holes dug around the camp. You get word on the woman who's been shot in the arm. The bullet entered at her elbow. She's screaming in pain. It looks like it traveled the length of her arm to her shoulder and is lodged there. Hours later, when the barrage of gunfire is stopped and you can raise your heads again, you look around to see that the APC, which was hung up on a tree stump, is now gone. No one in the camp has been hurt except for the woman, and the police have left. A helicopter flies overhead, and a few thousand feet higher, you can see the circling plane. Later that day, 2 camp members leave. You're afraid they'll not live to surrender, but they leave anyway. You are the judge in a trial that has lasted for 10 months. Cost to taxpayers $50,000 a day for its duration. It's the result of a standoff at Gustafson Lake, which was the most expensive deployment of RCMP in Canadian history. As a judge, it's up to you to see both sides of the issue and determine who is accountable. Who will go free? Who will go to jail? It's up to you to understand, especially in this case, the reasons for the standoff at Gustafson Lake. To understand why people did the things they did, and to serve justice as it's outlined in the Constitution of Canada and in the laws of the land, it's up to you to make the calls. You know that the stand was about land claims and native rights, contrary to what was portrayed in the media during the standoff. You know the RCMP used some very unorthodox means to achieve their objective of surrender without the loss of life, which included exploiting its ability to control the flow of information about the Gustafson Lake crisis to keep the public focused on the real issues. You know that the people in camp sincerely believed in what they were doing and weren't motivated by narrow interest or greed. You know that their issues were completely different from the ones the police were focusing on. You also know that several of the defendants still refuse to recognize the jurisdiction of the government, the judiciary, and the law enforcement agencies of British Columbia and Canada. You know that they were advised by a lawyer licensed to practice in some provinces that they had the right to employ weapons in self-defense. You also know that no court in the country has ever recognized the laws that this lawyer was referring to, and that the defendants all knew this. You know that this was the reason for their stand, to have their belief that the government, the judiciary, and the law enforcement of British Columbia and Canada recognized as illegal, because they violate international and constitutional law, as is outlined in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the Canadian Constitution of 1867, and the Constitution of 1982. The best you can do is consider these beliefs and motivatings as mitigating factors in your sentencing. You can't take a stand. 14 people guilty. You know that the stand the defenders were looking for was not at Gustafson Lake. You know that the stand the defenders was looking for wasn't at Gustafson Lake. It's a stand that requires all Canadians to evaluate the very status that we have as citizens of a nation composed of diverse cultures and customs. You also know the newcomer's here to stay, and at some point we'll all have to make an effort to understand all sides of this complex issue. Beyond Gustafson Lake, beyond the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and the Delgamuukw decision of 1997, it is a stand that has been made by all Canadians. It has to be made by all Canadians who truly believe in our Constitution, in justice, and in equality. You know that for our system to work, that all laws must be obeyed, not just the ones that are convenient for the moment, not just ones which serve to protect the material investment rights of one group of Canadians at the expense of the rights of another. You now know that Gustafson Lake was about a different kind of stand altogether. The only ones with the courage to take a stand were convicted for committing crimes against the state.